A Great Argead Saga Alexein, Alexander the Great. Volume 1, Telesias, The War Dance. By Macaulay. A new episode every single day. Episode 21, Game of Wills, the Agones, the Funeral Games. By the time the sun attained its zenith, the atmosphere of Igi had undergone a monstrous transfiguration. The solemn, wine-drenched silence that had filled the royal tombs was driven out, replaced by a predatory, ecstatic roaring that shook the limestone foundations of the arena. In Macedonian tradition, a king's funeral was never complete without the Agones, the funeral games. It was a brutal festival designed to prove to a watching world that though a sovereign might fall, the martial might of the state remained an unyielding block of iron. Philip stood within the deep, stifling shadow of a stone archway, having stripped off his heavy mourning tunic. His bare skin was still steeped in the sour, heavy fragrance of the wine used to cleanse his father's corpse, and his shoulders were smeared with the oily soot of the funeral pyre. He felt filthy, hollowed by grief, and dangerously cold. If I pull back now, he thought, his jaw clenching until his molars ached, I hand Ptolemy my head on a platter. They aren't here to honor a king. They are here to see if the wolf's cubs are soft enough to drown. To withdraw would be a public confession of his own fragility before the blood-hungry eyes of the entire Macedonian army. Euryno stepped out from the swirling dust, her face deathly pale. Her fingers trembled violently against the small wooden bowls she clutched, rattling the salted barley and dark dusted grapes within. "Eat this, Philip," she implored, her voice a frantic whisper. "Ptolemy chose that man specifically to humiliate you. Logos possesses double your mass. He doesn't know how to sport. He only knows how to butcher." Philip did not look at her. His gaze was a fixed, venomous needle, cutting through the glare of the track. He plucked a single grape and crushed it fiercely between his teeth. The sharp, painful sweetness flooded his mouth, cutting through the bitter ash of the vigil. It woke something vicious inside him. "Ptolemy hallucinates that my hunger makes me vulnerable," Philip replied, his voice a low, quiet hum that made Euryno shiver. "He has yet to realize the truth. Only the truly starving wolf understands the cold, precise artistry of the hunt that severs the prey's throat. A fat hound forgets how to bite." The roar of the herald's horn tore through the air. "Philip, Prince of Macedon, step forward and take your place in the pale." Philip exhaled, squared his unripened shoulders, and stepped out into the blinding white-hot light of the arena. High above, the regent Ptolemy leaned back against his purple-draped chair with the decadent, nauseating elegance of a man who had already grasped victory. To his left, the younger Attalus, the general, laughed raucously, tossing back a cup of raw, unwatered wine. His fingers obsessively tapped the bronze hilt of his sword, beating an unsettling cadence against his thigh. He was not a guardian of the crown, but a starving predator watching its prey stumble. Further down the box, Queen Eurydice and the young King Perdiccas sat frozen, masks of dread. They were shattered by the sight of Logos as he lumbered into the sun. The colossus resembled a boulder draped in scarred, tanned leather. His arms possessed a girth equal to Philip's entire waist. He looked down at the prince with the dull indifference of a stonemason about to move a megalith. "Use your mind, Philip," Euryno prayed, her knuckles white. "Find that monster's weakness." Ptolemy leaned over the railing, his eyes flashing with a cruel, blissful ecstasy. "Macedonia is a kingdom of iron," he murmured, his voice stripped of all pity. "And the quality of iron is tested only by friction. Let us watch closely to see just how much weight that boy can bear before he is snapped into." High above the carnage, old Attalus, the grim guardian, stood motionless. His hand was fused to the pommel of his massive longsword, his knuckles white. He watched the boy move, noting the terrifying, predatory stillness settling over Philip's features. "It is a madness," Attalus thought, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Logos is not a man. He is a slaughterhouse draped in skin. He will snap the boy like a dry reed." "The boy has the eyes of a wolf," Attalus rumbled, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that barely rose above the rustle of the soldiers. "But he is fighting a bear." He turned his head to the courtiers nearby, his stare saturated with such homicidal intent that they recoiled. "If he dies," Attalus continued, his tone a razor-edged whisper, "I will take the head of every man who set this match. Let them remember that the line holds, even if I have to paint this sand with the blood of the tutors who whispered these traps." Beside him, Parmenion did not blink, his attention fixed on the ring. But Antipater shifted slightly, sensing the tectonic shift in the old soldier's temper. The air in the royal box grew frigid. Attalus was no longer just guarding a prince, he was a coiled spring, and the entire court was now standing within his reach. Fight, boy, Attalus prayed in the silence of his mind. Defy the arithmetic of your own death. Because if you fall, the only thing left for me to do is to burn this kingdom down around their ankles. In the far corner of the royal box, away from the regent's chilling composure, sat Queen Gygia. Her 3 sons, Argead, Menelaus, and Archelaus, clustered around her like nervous hawks, their eyes wide as they watched the colossus, Logos, begin his slow, thunderous descent into the arena. The disparity was not just visible, it was insulting. Logos was a monument to brute, unchecked power, while Philip appeared, to all eyes but the most discerning, like a sacrificial lamb tethered for the slaughter. "Mother," Argead whispered, his voice cracking with the strain of suppressed panic. "Look at the giant's arms. He could snap our brother like a dry twig. Why is Ptolemy allowing this? It isn't a game, it's an execution." Gygia did not turn her head. Her face was a study in controlled, porcelain-hard tension. She felt the weight of the court's gaze upon them, waiting to see if the other branch of the royal house would weep or cheer. If he dies, Gygia thought, her heart drumming a frantic, jagged rhythm, the regency becomes absolute. Ptolemy will have the blood of Amyntas on his hands and the crown on his head, and we will be nothing but inconvenient ghosts in the hallways of Aegae. Menelaus, the middle son, leaned in, his voice a low, desperate rasp. "Philip is going to die. I've watched him train, he is fast, yes, but he is a boy. Logos is a machine. If we don't protest, if we don't stop this. And how would you stop it?" Gygia cut in, her tone sharp, though her eyes remained fixed on Philip's small, still figure. "By challenging the regent. By handing Ptolemy a reason to prune the family tree further?" Archelaus, the youngest, watched his brother with a dawning, morbid fascination. "He's standing so still," he murmured, his voice laced with a strange, burgeoning awe. "He doesn't look afraid. He looks like he's waiting for something." "The dice are loaded," Gygia mused, a cold clarity settling over her. "The outcome is already etched in the regent's eyes. He expects a funeral. But if Philip survives, if by some divine, impossible geometry he stands, the entire structure of this kingdom collapses tonight." She felt a surge of terrifying, irrational hope. She looked at her sons, her expression shifting from regal detachment to a fierce, whispered intensity. "We do not cry," Gygia commanded, her voice dropping to a dangerous low vibration. "We cheer. If the crowd sees us mourning, they see the end of a dynasty. If they see us cheering, they see the return of a king." "But mother," Argead stammered, "he is fighting a monster." "Then he must become a monster," she replied, her eyes burning. "Do not look at his size. Look at his stillness. If you believe he will die, he will. But if we project the strength of the Argead name, if we roar for him as if he has already won, we might just anchor him to this world." She stood, her posture defying the crushing weight of the court's skepticism. "Cheer, my sons. Not because you believe it is easy. Cheer because it is the only way to make the impossible come true. If he dies, we have at least stood with our blood. If he wins," she allowed herself a small, icy smile. "If he wins, the world changes, and we will be standing on the winning side of the precipice." As Philip stepped into the center of the arena, the 3 sons drew a ragged, collective breath. They didn't cheer out of certainty, they cheered because their mothers will force the sound from their throats, a desperate, rallying cry that cut through the calcified silence of the arena like a blade. "Philip!" They roared in unison, a fragile, defiant sound. "Fight," Gygia prayed, her hands hidden deep in the folds of her dress, gripping her own flesh until it bruised. "Fight, little wolf. Make them regret the day they thought you were a lamb." In the shadow of a stone pillar, far removed from the predatory excitement of the High Lords, Menes of Larissa stood with a firm hand on Philena's shoulder. He was a man who had seen too many winters of discontent in the Thessalian plains, and he knew the look of a condemned man before the axe fell. Philena's knuckles were white, her fingers buried deep into the folds of her silk wrap as she stared into the arena. Below, the contrast was sickening. Philip, slight and pale, looked like a child lost in a storm, while Logos stood like a monolith of bludgeoning muscle, testing the heft of his heavy gladius. "Keep your eyes down, child," Menes rumbled, his voice a weary rasp. He didn't look at the ring, he watched the sky, as if searching for a sign that the gods had not yet abandoned the Argead name. The nobility is a dying breed today. They are vultures in fine linen, waiting to see if a prince can be broken. Idi is a tomb, not a playground. The soil here has been thirsty for kings for too long. Felena shifted, her breath hitching. She had traveled with dreams of a glittering Macedonian court, a king rising to restore the old glory. Instead, she found only the stench of smoke and the promise of a butcher's work. "He looks so small, Menes," she whispered, her eyes wide as she tracked Philip's unnervingly fluid, calm movements. "I dreamt of a king, not a slaughterhouse. Will he really die for their sport?" Menes tightened his grip, his eyes sliding toward the arena. He saw the way the boy's gaze locked onto the Thracian mercenary. No fear, only a terrifying, cold focus. "Sport is what they call it," Menes said, his jaw tightening. "But look at him. That is not the look of a boy waiting for a funeral. It is the look of a boy who has already decided he will not be the one in the grave. If he stands, he will not be a king they can easily govern." Parmenion, the silent arbiter, remained a fixture of unyielding granite beside the volatile Attalus. He watched the boy with a cold, detached appraisal of a stonemason examining a foundation block for structural weakness. "The boy is a test," Parmenion said, his voice like grinding stones. "If he falls, Macedonia deserves to burn under the Illyrians. If he stands, then perhaps there is a future worth defending. Either way, he is the only variable that matters." Antipater, the architect of ruin, stood slightly behind them, his gaze cold and flat. While Attalus prepared to kill and Parmenion prepared to judge, Antipater was already living in the aftermath. "If the prince dies, the regency is finalized, the transition will be bloodless, if not clean," he murmured, his tone as precise as a scribe's needle. "If he lives, he becomes a symbol. I have already drafted the decree for either outcome. Politics is the art of turning a tragedy into an asset." Suddenly, the younger Attalus roared, his voice dripping with a cruel, mocking delight that drew a wave of laughter from the mercenaries. "Do not kill him, Logos," he shouted, his face flushed with the pleasure of the prince's degradation. "Torment him slowly, exhaust him, make him shriek and beg for mercy. Make that prince realize the absolute truth. In Macedonia, it is always the earth that crushes all abstractions." "As you command," Logos grunted, a sound like grinding gravel. A few paces removed, foreign lords held court in the shadows. Lord Dirtus of Elamia leaned into his circle. "Patience," he murmured. "The prince is a sacrificial lamb. When he falls, the Elimiate claim to the mountain passes will be signed in his blood. Watch the regent, he is more worried than he lets on." Across from him, Creon of Pheres sat with languid, predatory ease, tapping a heavy gold ring against the stone. Clink, clink, clink. Funeral game in the capital of the dead. "How fitting," Creon remarked, his tone dripping with aristocratic malice. "The Argeads are performing their own wake. I'm merely here to witness the final expiration. The question is not who wins, but which of us will be the first to carve his portion out of the carcass." Then the giant charged, his heavy sandals making the earth rumble. The impact was catastrophic. It was as if a giant oak tree had collapsed directly into Philip's chest, the kinetic force hurling the prince's frame through the air to crash into the dirt. Dust swirled in a thick, choking cloud. Attalus shouted with glee, slapping his knee. "Run, little rabbit. The house of Macedon claims the lineage of Heracles. Is it that sacred martial prowess that runs through your veins, boy, or the heart of a panicked hare?" High above, Ptolemy sat in a mask of marble stillness, though his mind was a storm. He had heard the younger Attalus's promise to be the butcher, and the chilling clarity of the young man's bloodlust sent a ripple of alarm through him. A viper, Ptolemy thought, his fingers curling into his robes. He isn't just ambitious, he's hungry in a way that ignores the boundaries of statecraft. If I unleash him, he will not just devour the prince, he will devour the entire board. He looked down at the arena. The optics were catastrophic. To every noble, he and this cruel young general were a singular, monstrous entity intent on executing the last son of Amyntas. Will the boy even be salvageable? Ptolemy wondered, a vein pulsing in his temple. If I save him, he will be a martyr with a vendetta. If he is ruined, he is useless. He took a slow, steadying breath. He would let the game play out, but his eyes were no longer on the prince. They were on the young butcher standing at his side. You want to be the butcher boy? Very well. But in this court, even the butchers are eventually led to the block. The arena air, thick with the scent of copper and churned clay, grew heavy with the weight of the impossible. Philip lay in the dirt, breath completely driven from his lungs, his ribs screaming in a white-hot flash of agony. Get up, his mind hissed, a cold, clinical command that severed itself from the panic of his physical body. Don't look at the crowd. Don't look at Ptolemy. Watch the weight. As Logos surged forward, the giant's massive shadow eclipsed the sun. Philip didn't stand. He exploded into motion, rolling through the dust just as a heavy, sandal-clad foot cratered the earth where his head had been a heartbeat before. Run, little rabbit! Attilus's mocking voice boomed from above. Philip scrambled to his feet, chest heaving, his legs burning. He moved in a frantic, stuttering rhythm, feinting left, then darting right, forcing the giant to chase him. He ran like a rabbit, yes, but a rabbit that knew the terrain of the warren. He stayed just out of reach, letting Logos tire himself with heavy, thundering strides. Too heavy, Philip noted. Every step is a commitment. He's a fortress, and a fortress cannot change direction in a heartbeat. Logos roared, frustrated by the boy's evasive skittering, and lunged with a massive overhead swing. Philip didn't block, he pivoted, sliding low into the red clay, passing directly beneath the giant's guard. As he slid, he felt the displaced air of the mist blow, a lethal wind that would have shattered his collarbone. He emerged on the other side, instantly repositioning, his eyes locked on the giant's heels. He was baiting him, drawing the mountain into a specific rhythm. He forced Logos toward the center of the arena, where the morning sacrificial wine had soaked the sand into a slick, treacherous paste. How would Heracles fight this monster? Philip thought, his eyes narrowing through the dust. He wouldn't try to lift the mountain. He would make the mountain fall. Logos caught on. He stopped chasing and planted his feet, waiting for Philip to drift within arm's reach. The giant's patience was as terrifying as his strength. He feigned a lazy swipe, then suddenly pivoted with surprising speed to pin the prince against the rising stone wall of the arena. It was the opening Philip had manufactured. As Logos pivoted, his massive trunk of a leg bore his entire weight into the damp patch of sand. The giant's foot slipped for a fraction of a second. Within that heartbeat, Philip realized, this is it. To grapple head-on was suicide, but the mountain was now leaning, its own momentum betraying it. In a blur of motion, Philip lunged. He didn't strike the giant's impenetrable chest. He struck with the pitiless precision of a snake, his fingertips gouging the giant's vision. Logos flinched, a guttural bark of pain escaping him as darkness hit him. While the colossus was off balance and blinded, Philip drove his shoulders directly into the lateral joint of the man's planted knee, twisting it with the full leverage of his body weight. A sickening, crushing sound, like green wood being ripped apart, echoed across the stadium. Jaya! Logos collapsed like a felled tower. Before the giant could register the earth, Philip scrambled onto his back with the terrifying agility of a cat. Wrapping his arms, now charged with the desperate white-hot hardness of steel, around the giant's throat, he strangled the larynx with unyielding force. Logos thrashed, his massive fingers tearing at Philip's forearms, but the choke was locked. The giant's movements grew sluggish, his face turning a bruised terminal purple until his arms dropped limply into the dust. The silence that descended upon Igi was not one of shock, but of terrified realization. High in the shadows, Ismenias of Thebes stood perfectly still. His lieutenant shifted, a hand moving to his sword, but Ismenias raised a gloved hand to stop him. He watched Philip, a blood-drenched, breathing statue, surveying the royal box. Arithmetic, Ismenias thought, his cold smile vanishing. That was not the flailing of a desperate boy. That was a masterclass in leverage. The variable has shifted, Ismenias murmured. He's no longer a failure to be discarded. He's a weapon that has just proven its edge. He looked at the Theban vanguard, masters of tactical geometry, and saw the reflection of his own dawning, unwelcome respect. He knows. The moment he killed that brute, he stopped being a prince and started being a threat to every man in that box. Nearby, the Athenian representative smoothed his robes, his condescending smile faltering. A broken prince is a tragedy, he murmured to his aide, his voice dry and pitiless. But a survivor is a complication we are not prepared for. In the tears, the transformation was total. Manus of Larissa, who had been braced as if to catch a falling star, surged forward. "Look at the stance," he roared, his voice cracking with unbridled excitement. He didn't just survive, he dictated the end. Beside him, Felina had abandoned the safety of the shadows. Her fear had evaporated, replaced by a fierce, radiant defiance. Philip. The name pierced the din, a singular note of triumph. She leaned over the stone railing, face tear-streaked and luminous. "Philip." Manus laughed, a sharp barking sound of disbelief. He clapped a heavy hand onto her shoulder, his eyes locked on the arena. "He heard you, girl." Or perhaps he didn't, it doesn't matter. "Look at them." The vultures in the high box are turning pale, and the generals are scrambling for their ledgers. In the far corner of the royal box, Queen Gigia and her 3 sons remain motionless for a heartbeat, paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of what their eyes had witnessed. The giant lay broken, and the boy, the lamb, stood tall in the carnage. As the reality of the victory crashed over them like a tidal wave, Gigia's regal composure shattered. Tears of raw, unfiltered relief traced paths through the dust on her cheeks, her hand flying to her throat to stifle a sob of pure gratitude. "He did it," Argead breathed, his voice trembling with a nascent golden awe. Beside him, Menelaus and Archelaus erupted, the tension of a lifetime exploding into a primal, thunderous scream that rose above the confusion of the stadium. "Philip! Philip!" The brothers shouted, their voices raw and unfiltered, their eyes ablaze with the sudden, intoxicating realization that the impossible was not only possible, but achieved. They cheered not as courtiers, but as brothers witnessing the birth of a legend. Down in the red clay, Philip finally stood upright. He did not look at the roaring crowd, nor did he offer the traditional salute to the regent. He wiped the gore from his blade with a slow, deliberate grace, his slate-gray eyes locking onto the royal dais. He was no longer a victim. He was an apex predator, and the world he had once been expected to die in had just become his to conquer. Yet the object of Philip's gaze was no longer the writhing, dying monster beneath him. His eyes shot straight through the dust, locking directly onto Ptolemy and young Attalus upon the high dais. The arrogant sneer that had twisted Attalus's face vanished, replaced by a pale, slack-jawed shock. Beside him, the regent Ptolemy leaned forward, his mask of composure finally fracturing. He had expected a tragic end, a convenient, blood-soaked footnote to secure his own rule, but as he watched the boy, a cold, sharp realization pierced his chest. This last son of Amyntas has more than just grit. He has a mind that sees the board beneath the blood. Ptolemy's thoughts drifted back to the late king Amyntas, whom he had served for long, grueling years until the day of his death. He remembered the old king's temper, his cunning, and his iron-willed obsession with the Macedonian legacy. The first son was unthinkable, a brute of a different make, Ptolemy mused, his gaze darkening. The second, weak and still hiding in the shadows of the throne. But Philip. He was different. As the prince stood amidst the gore, his gaze cutting through the stadium like a blade, Ptolemy saw the ghost of the man he had once called sovereign. A tremor of genuine, primal unease rippled through his veins. "Dear king," he thought, a flicker of haunted recognition in his eyes, "your last son does not just carry your name, he carries your blood, and he has finally learned how to spill it." Heracles did not slaughter monsters with the mere muscle of his fists. "Attalus." Philip hurled the words, his voice cracking with the strain of youth but ringing with a terrifying, absolute authority. He looked down at the giant's body, which lay motionless like a discarded doll of mud and gore. "A rabbit does not run because it is consumed by terror," Philip shouted, his chest heaving as he stood over the fallen titan. The son of Heracles merely waits utterly still for the hunter to trip over his own weight. "Answer me, general. Does my blood still appear vulnerable to you?" Attalus twisted his face in a sudden defensive disdain, his cheeks flushing a violent, humiliated red. He opened his mouth to unleash a volley of abuse, but before a single word could form, Parmenion reached out and clamped a heavy, armored hand onto his shoulder. The grip was iron, a silent, crushing command to remain still. Parmenion stared fixedly at Philip through the shimmering heat waves, a new, lethal reverence dwelling within his dark eyes. He had witnessed a terrifying truth that every other man present, blinded by politics and muscle, had overlooked. 14-year-old Philip had not merely desired victory. He had sought to annihilate the very foundation of the men who disdained him. He had stripped them of their certainty, leaving them exposed in their own arena. High in the shadows of the tiers, the Lyncestian and Elymite spies, men whose lives depended on the accuracy of their reports to the border lords, clutched the stone balustrades until their fingers went numb. Nearby, a lone, unassuming man in the nondescript robes of a merchant kept his head bowed, his hands tucked into his sleeves. He was a shadow agent of Bartolus the Illyrian, and his eyes had been tracking Philip with the precision of an assassin. "Impossible," the Lyncestian hissed, his gaze locked on the way Philip wiped his blade on the mercenary's tunic. He was supposed to be a hollow reed. He fought like he had been planning that specific death for a decade. "Look at his breathing," the Elymite spy whispered, his voice trembling. "He's not celebrating. He's not even looking at the crowd. He's looking toward the southern gate, toward the Theban lines. He didn't just beat a mercenary, he just murdered the regent's favorite tool." My lords will not like this, the Elymite thought, his mind racing through the consequences. The boy was the sacrificial lamb meant to die, so the mountains could be seized. Instead, he's become the sharpest blade in the room. If he survived the bear, he won't be afraid of the wolves. We have been watching a crown prince, we should have been watching a conqueror. The Bartolus agent remained silent, his heart a cold, steady drum. He had seen the way Philip twisted the giant's knee, a move learned not from a tutor, but from the brutal, pragmatic school of Illyrian mountain warfare. "He is not Macedonian," the Illyrian agent mused, a chill tracing his spine. "He fights with the savage, calculating economy of my own people. If this boy rises, he will not just hold the borders, he will erase them." "He's a ghost," the Lyncestian murmured, his hand subconsciously moving to the dagger hidden in his belt. Logos could have crushed his skull with one hand. Did you see the boy's eyes? When the brute went for his throat, Philip didn't panic. He steered him. He used the brute's own momentum to drive the metal into his neck. The Lyncestian's inner thought was colder, sharper. The regent is a dead man walking. He just turned a sacrificial lamb into an apex predator. If I report this as a miracle, I'm a fool. If I report this as a calculated slaughter, I'm a liability. "Write it down," the Lyncestian commanded, his voice a tremor of genuine fear. "Don't write that he won. Write that he didn't blink when he killed. Write that he didn't care about the crowd." He was waiting for someone to come down into the ring, and he looks disappointed that they haven't. Below, Philip remained motionless, his slate-gray eyes scanning the royal box, not for mercy and not for applause, but with the cold, hungry intensity of a boy who had finally realized that the world wasn't a game, but a map to be conquered. "The Elymite passes," the spy breathed, clutching his ledger as if it could shield him from the chill crawling up his spine. "Forget the passes. If the prince is this dangerous, we need to decide tonight whether we serve him or bury him." The Illyrian agent slipped away into the press of the crowd, his face a mask of iron. "I have no ledger to write in," he thought, his hand brushing the hilt of his concealed blade. "I only have a message to deliver. Bartolus must know that the boy is not a prize. He is an infection, and he must be cut out before he spreads." In the royal box, the air was a vacuum. Queen Eurydice sat like a statue of cooling ash. "He is no longer mine," she thought, the realization sharper than steel. "The boy who sought my comfort after the fire, he has been burned away. What stands there is a stranger forged in blood. If he lives, he will never again look at me with the eyes of a child." King Perdiccas, barely older than his brother, shrank back into his chair, his gaze flitting nervously toward the regent. "He did what the generals couldn't," the boy king whispered internally, his heart hammering against his ribs. "If he can take a life so cleanly, so coldly, what is to stop him from taking mine?" Princess Eurino felt a suffocating cocktail of relief and profound, soul-shattering guilt. She looked at her mother and saw the same detachment. They were no longer a mother and a sister watching a loved one, but spectators watching a political deity ascend. "He has gained his life, but he has lost his humanity," Eurydice's eyes seemed to convey to her daughter. "And in this kingdom, humanity is the only currency we can no longer afford." Ptolemy sat motionless, his fingers white-knuckled against the gilded armrest. He watched Philip, blood-drenched, breathing, and radiating, a cold, predatory intensity, and realized with a sinking heart that the lamb had shattered the very slaughterhouse meant to contain him. For years, Ptolemy had viewed himself not as a usurper, but as the only structural support left for a crumbling edifice. He had stepped into the regency not out of vanity, but out of necessity, driven by the grueling task of steering Macedon away from the precipice of bankruptcy and total annihilation by the ravenous powers circling its borders. He had been the steward of a dying kingdom, making the brutal, necessary compromises to ensure that, when the final collapse came, the name of Macedon would not be entirely erased from the map. But as he looked down at the boy who had just dismantled a giant, Ptolemy felt the chilling weight of his own obsolescence. The house of cards was not just trembling, it was beginning to collapse, and he realized with a jolt of genuine terror that he had spent his entire tenure trying to patch a roof, only to have the foundation itself rise up to reclaim the house. He was no longer the architect of survival. He was merely an obstacle to the new violent reality Philip had just carved into the clay. To be continued in episode 21. Price of a Prince watch and listen now. Watch the cinematic video trailer. Listen to the full saga now. Bookmark Volume 1, Telesias playlist. Bookmark Volume 1, Divine Oracle playlist. Join the Vanguard. A new episode drops every single day until the epic conclusion of Volume 1. Each chapter delivers a tight, hyper-focused 10 to 30-minute hit of cinematic historical drama, perfect for your daily plunge into antiquity. Subscribe to follow the bloody rise of the Argead dynasty. Thumbs up to help push our Vanguard through the algorithm's gauntlet. Comment below.